Story disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction and is intended for entertainment purposes only. The content includes dark themes, horror elements, and fictional depictions of rituals and sacrifices that are purely imaginative and not reflective of any real-life practices or beliefs. Viewer discretion is advised. This video is not suitable for younger audiences, and parental guidance is recommended. The story does not endorse or promote any harmful behavior, violence, or dangerous activities. Please note that all characters, events, and settings are entirely fictional and created for the purpose of storytelling. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. In the bustling city of Zandra, Nia, a humble market seller, stumbles upon a mysterious black mask that plunges her into a hidden battle between light and shadow. Chosen by the dark force Nyembi, Nia must confront terrifying visions, ancient cults, and her darkest fears to save herself and the world around her. With the help of her ally Tunde, she embarks on a perilous journey to unravel the truth behind the abyss and the power it holds, while facing relentless enemies and trials that will test her courage and resolve. Will Nia embrace the darkness or become the light that can destroy it? In the bustling city of Zandra, where ancient traditions clashed with modern life, Nia lived a quiet life, running her small market stall. Zandra was no ordinary city, it was known for its ancient secrets and forgotten lore. Beneath the gleaming skyscrapers and busy streets, dark forces had been at work for centuries, hidden from the ordinary eyes of its citizens. One day, while walking home through the crowded marketplace, Nia felt a strange pull. It was subtle at first, but soon it became impossible to ignore. The sky grew dark, though it was only late afternoon. She turned down a narrow alley, where she saw a strange object lying at her feet, the small, black mask. It glistened under the dim light, its surface reflecting a pale glow, almost as if it were alive. She hesitated but felt an overwhelming urge to pick it up. The moment her fingers touched the mask, a cold wave rushed through her body. It felt as if time had stopped. Her surroundings blurred, and the sounds of the market faded into a hollow silence. She was no longer in Zandra but in a place of shadow, where unseen eyes watched her from every corner. A whisper echoed in her mind, repeating a single name, Nyembi. The voice was deep and ancient, filled with power and malice. "You have been chosen," it said, the words heavy with dark intent. Nia dropped the mask, her heart pounding. The world snapped back to normal, and she found herself back in the alley. But something was wrong. The air was colder, and the once bustling marketplace was now eerily silent. The people who passed by looked at her with suspicion, as though they could sense something had changed. As Nia hurried home, her thoughts raced. What had she touched? And what was Nyembi? She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had been set into motion, something that couldn't be undone. That night, as she lay in bed, the shadows in her room seemed to move on their own. She tried to tell herself it was her imagination, but the whisper returned, louder this time, as if the voice was inside her head. The next morning, Nia woke up drenched in sweat, her dreams filled with dark, twisted images she couldn't remember clearly. Her head ached, and the whisper from the night before echoed in her mind like a distant drumbeat. She tried to shake off the feeling of dread as she went about her day, but Zandra felt different. People were avoiding her. Their eyes darted away as soon as they met hers, as though they knew something she didn't. That evening, as the sun set over the city, she noticed a figure standing at the edge of the market. He was cloaked in shadow, and though his face was hidden, she could feel his gaze burning into her. She turned to leave, but everywhere she went, she felt eyes watching her. Later, when she returned home, Nia locked her doors and closed the curtains, trying to block out the growing fear that was gnawing at her. But the moment she sat down, a loud knock echoed through the room. Her heart froze. She hadn't been expecting anyone, especially not at this late hour. "Who is it?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. With trembling hands, she opened the door slightly, just enough to peer through the crack. There was no one there. She opened the door wider and stepped outside cautiously, scanning the street. The air was still, and the only sound was the distant hum of the city. But as she turned to go back inside, she saw something strange on her doorstep. A black feather. It was sleek and shimmered under the moonlight in a way that made her stomach churn. Before she could pick it up, a cold gust of wind blew past her, carrying the faintest of whispers, "Nyembi is watching." The next day, Nia couldn't shake the strange events from the night before. She tried to go about her routine, but the eerie feeling that had settled over her wouldn't leave. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, making it hard to breathe. As she wandered the market later that day, she noticed something unusual. A group of people, all dressed in dark robes, stood silently at the far end of the square. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. No one else seemed to notice them, but Nia could feel their eyes on her. She hurried past, but wherever she went, the group seemed to follow her, always just out of sight but never far away. When she finally returned home that evening, she was exhausted and shaken. But as she stepped through her door, something caught her eye. There, on her mirror, was the same black feather she had seen the night before. She hadn't brought it in. How had it gotten there? A chill ran down her spine as she noticed something else, her reflection. The mark of Nyembi had appeared on her forehead, faint but unmistakable. It pulsed with a dark, eerie glow. The knock came again, louder this time, as if someone, or something, was demanding to be let in. "Open the door, Nia," the voice hissed from outside. It was the same voice she had heard in her dreams. Dark and ancient, with a power that sent waves of fear crashing through her. Nia backed away from the door, her hands trembling. She didn't know what to do. Whatever was on the other side, it was far worse than anything she could have imagined. The knocking grew louder, more urgent. Nia backed away, her heart racing. The shadow in the mirror seemed to move, pulsing with dark energy, as though Nyembi himself was watching her through the reflection. She didn't dare open the door, but the force on the other side was relentless. It felt as if the entire house was shaking with each knock. Suddenly, the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. Nia let out a scream, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness that spilled in like thick smoke. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a tall, cloaked figure whose face was hidden beneath a hood. His eyes gleamed like burning coals. "You cannot escape what is already in motion," the figure whispered, his voice deep and filled with menace. "The mark has chosen you." Nia froze, unable to move. The figure reached out, his hand covered in intricate symbols that glowed faintly under the dim light of her room. He placed something on the table, a small, black stone, etched with the same strange markings she had seen on the mask. The stone pulsed with a sinister light, and the air around it seemed to hum with dark power. "You have until the next moonrise to make your decision," the figure said, his voice sending chills down her spine. "If you choose to resist, the shadows will consume you." With that, the figure disappeared into the darkness, leaving Nia alone in her room. The stone on the table pulsed once more before settling into a faint glow. Nia knew she had to act, but what was she supposed to do? The mark on her forehead seemed to burn with the weight of the decision she would soon have to make. The next night, unable to shake the fear that had gripped her, Nia ventured back to the marketplace. The air was thick with tension, and every shadow seemed to whisper her name. She could feel the pull of the black stone, as though it was calling her back to something ancient and forgotten. At midnight, she found herself standing at the edge of the old market square, the place where Zandra's oldest secrets were buried. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows. In the center of the square, a group had gathered, cloaked figures with faces hidden, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Nia approached cautiously, her heart pounding. The leader of the group, a tall figure with a golden mask, stepped forward. His voice was deep, echoing through the silence of the night. "You are late," he said, his tone sharp and cold. "The time for indecision has passed." The crowd of cloaked figures parted, revealing an old stone altar, covered in dark symbols that seemed to pulse with energy. Nia felt drawn to it, her body moving against her will. "This is the moment of truth, Nia," the leader said, his voice growing darker. "The stone has chosen you, and now you must choose in return." She glanced around, searching for a way out, but there was none. The group had surrounded her, and their eyes seemed to glow with the same strange light as the stone. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of unseen forces. "You can accept your fate and embrace the darkness," the leader said, his voice like ice, "or you can resist. But know this, resistance comes at a cost." Before she could respond, the shadows around her seemed to move. They twisted and swirled, forming strange shapes that made her heart race with terror. The air felt electric, charged with some ancient, dark power that made the hair on her skin stand on end. Nia stood frozen, torn between the overwhelming pull of the darkness and the instinct to run. The moment Nia's hand hovered over the stone, a flood of memories surged through her mind, memories that were not hers. She saw ancient rituals in forgotten villages, where powerful forces were summoned from the depths of the earth. She saw the people of Zandra, centuries ago, making dark pacts with spirits and forces that should have remained buried. The visions were overwhelming. Faces of the past flickered before her eyes, people who had stood where she stood now, forced to choose between darkness and light. Most had chosen the shadows, their eyes glowing with the same sinister energy that now surrounded her. Suddenly, the vision shifted, and she saw something that made her blood run cold. It was a vision of herself, standing on the same altar, her face pale, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The mark of Nyembi burned brightly on her forehead, and around her, the cloaked figures bowed, chanting in a language she didn't understand. But the meaning was clear, she had become one of them. "No!" Nia screamed, pulling her hand away from the stone. The vision stopped, and the air around her went still. She was back in the square, but the choice still hung over her like a dark cloud. The leader of the cloaked figures stepped forward, his golden mask glinting in the moonlight. "You have seen the truth of what you are," he said. "You cannot deny your destiny. The mark has chosen you." Nia shook her head, stepping back. "I didn't choose this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Choice is an illusion," the leader replied, his voice cold and final. "You were chosen long before you were born. The shadows have always been a part of you." The air around her grew colder, and the ground beneath her feet began to shift. The cloaked figures chanted softly, their voices rising in unison. The shadows seemed to come alive, crawling toward her like living things, ready to consume her. Nia turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she fled into the night, she knew that the darkness would follow her, no matter where she went. Nia ran through the empty streets of Zandra, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The city was eerily quiet, as though the very life had been drained from it. The shadows stretched long and thin, reaching out to her as she passed. She could feel the weight of the darkness following her, closing in with every step she took. She didn't know where she was going, but her legs carried her as fast as they could. Every corner she turned, she felt the presence of the cloaked figures, lurking just out of sight. Their eyes were always watching, glowing faintly from the shadows. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She dared not look back, but she could feel them, closing in, getting closer with every passing second. The streets twisted and turned, becoming a maze of alleys and narrow paths that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, she stumbled upon an old building at the edge of the city. Its doors were worn, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. She hesitated, but the sound of the approaching footsteps pushed her forward. She had no choice but to enter. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of incense lingered. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of candles that lined the walls. In the center stood an old man, his back turned to her. His voice was low and steady, as though he had been waiting for her all along. "Welcome, Nia," he said without turning. "I have been expecting you." The old man's voice echoed in the dimly lit room. Nia's heart pounded as she stepped forward, unsure of who he was or how he knew her name. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls, making everything seem like it was alive. The symbols on the walls pulsed with an otherworldly energy that made the air feel thick. "You've been running, but you can't outrun your fate," the old man said, his voice filled with a strange knowing. He finally turned to face her, his eyes glowing faintly, just like the cloaked figures. Nia's breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I am the keeper of what is hidden," he replied cryptically. "The one who watches over the shadows." As the old man spoke, Nia felt something shift in the room. The air grew colder, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to move, as though the ground itself was alive. She could feel an unseen force pressing against her, pushing her toward the old man, as if the room had a will of its own. Suddenly, the ground cracked open beneath her feet, revealing a deep, dark void. Nia stumbled back in shock, her arms flailing as she tried to regain her balance. The void seemed endless, a swirling abyss of darkness that threatened to swallow her whole. "You have one final chance to choose," the old man said, his voice growing darker. "You can embrace what has been set in motion, or you can fall into the abyss." Nia looked down at the void, then back at the old man. The weight of the decision was crushing her, and she felt like the darkness was pulling her in. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, a hand shot out from the shadows and grabbed her ankle. She screamed, her body jerking violently as the unseen force pulled her toward the edge of the abyss. She kicked and struggled, but the grip only tightened. In that moment, she realized the truth: the shadows weren't just following her. They were a part of her. Nia screamed as she felt herself being dragged closer to the abyss, the hand that gripped her ankle cold as ice. The old man watched in silence, his expression calm and unmoving, as if he had seen this happen many times before. With one last desperate effort, Nia twisted free, pulling herself away from the edge just as the ground beneath her crumbled into the void. Panting and trembling, she scrambled to her feet, her ankle throbbing where the shadowy hand had grabbed her. But the pain was more than just physical. As she looked down at her leg, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. There, on her ankle, was a dark mark, one that matched the symbol on the stone from the marketplace. It pulsed with a sinister glow, sending sharp pain through her body. The old man stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the mark. "You've been marked by the darkness," he said quietly, but with a sense of finality. "There's no turning back now." Nia's head spun. "What does this mean?" she demanded, fear creeping into her voice. "It means that you are bound to the shadows," the old man replied. "The mark is a seal of fate. It cannot be undone." Nia's heart raced as panic set in. She could feel the darkness creeping up her leg, like cold vines wrapping around her body. She tried to rub the mark away, but it only grew stronger, pulsing faster with every breath she took. "You cannot resist it," the old man continued, his voice calm but with a sinister edge. "The more you fight, the stronger it becomes. Embrace it, or it will consume you." Terror gripped Nia as she realized that the darkness wasn't just something outside of her, it was inside her. And it was growing. Nia couldn't stay in that place any longer. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air thick with the weight of the darkness that now marked her. Without thinking, she bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was running to, but she knew she had to get away from that room, from that old man, from everything. As she sprinted through the streets, she could feel the mark pulsing on her ankle, sending waves of cold through her body. Her mind raced. Was there anyone who could help her? Was there a way to undo this? The streets were empty, eerily quiet, as if the whole city was asleep. But Nia knew better. The shadows were watching her. They were always watching. She could feel them lurking in every corner, waiting for the moment she would let her guard down. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement, a figure, dressed in black, moving swiftly through the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it one of them? The cloaked figures. She picked up her pace, but the figure was fast. It darted through the alleyways, always just out of reach. And then, without warning, it stopped, standing still in the middle of the road. Nia skidded to a halt, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure turned slowly to face her, and Nia's blood ran cold. It was her. The woman standing before her was a mirror image of herself, down to the clothes she was wearing, the fear in her eyes. But there was one difference: this version of Nia had fully embraced the darkness. Her eyes glowed with the same sinister light as the stone, and the mark on her ankle had spread across her entire body. Who are you?" Nia whispered, her voice barely audible. The dark version of herself smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent chills down her spine. "I am what you will become." Nia stood frozen, staring at the dark version of herself. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. The dark figure stepped closer, her eyes glowing brighter, the mark pulsing with energy that seemed to vibrate in the air. "This is your future," the dark Nia said, her voice a twisted version of Nia's own. "The shadows are not just following you. They are you." Nia shook her head, stepping back. "No, this isn't real. This isn't happening." But the dark version of herself only laughed, the chilling sound that echoed through the empty streets. "You cannot escape your fate. The mark has chosen you, and soon you will belong to the darkness." As the words left her mouth, the ground beneath Nia began to shake. The sky darkened, and the shadows around her seemed to stretch and grow, wrapping around her like tendrils. She tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The darkness was closing in, swallowing her whole. Nia screamed, but the sound was lost in the void as the shadows engulfed her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Nia's scream was swallowed by the darkness. The tendrils of shadow wrapped tighter around her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Every inch of her skin burned with cold, the mark on her ankle now spreading like wildfire, reaching up her leg. It felt like the darkness was alive, like it was feeding on her fear. Just when she thought she would be consumed entirely, everything stopped. She was no longer falling. The darkness loosened its grip, and Nia found herself floating in an empty void. There was no ground, no sky, just an endless expanse of black. Her heart pounded as she looked around, trying to make sense of where she was. "Is this the end?" she whispered to herself. A soft laugh echoed through the void, sending chills down her spine. It was the same laugh from before, the laugh of her dark reflection. Nia turned, and there she was again, the shadowy version of herself, standing just a few feet away, watching her with those glowing eyes. "This is where it all begins," the dark Nia said, her voice dripping with malice. "You've been fighting against the inevitable, but you cannot escape what you are." Nia took a step back, her mind racing. "I'm not like you," she spat, her voice trembling. "I'll never become what you are." The dark figure tilted her head, her smile widening. "You don't have a choice. The mark has already chosen you. It's only a matter of time before you accept it, or lose yourself completely." As she spoke, the shadows around them began to shift, forming shapes, figures. Nia's eyes widened in horror as she recognized them. They were the cloaked figures from before, the ones who had been following her. But now they were unmasked, their faces with agony. Their eyes glowed with the same eerie light, and their mouths moved as if whispering something she couldn't hear. "You see them now," the dark Nia said, her voice soft but menacing. "These are the ones who tried to resist the darkness. They failed. And now they serve it." Nia's heart raced as she looked at the figures, their faces haunting her. "I won't let this happen to me," she said, her voice shaking but determined. The dark Nia's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You already belong to the shadows. The only question is, how long will you fight before you give in?" Nia's breath hitched as the ground beneath her feet suddenly reappeared, solid and cold. She could feel the weight of the shadows pressing down on her, but something inside her refused to surrender. "I will fight," she whispered, more to herself than to the shadow. "Then prepare for war," the dark version of herself replied, her eyes narrowing. The void vanished, and Nia found herself standing in the middle of an unfamiliar street, the city of Kisa surrounding her once again. But something was different, everything was too quiet. The usually bustling streets were deserted, the once vibrant markets now eerily still. It felt like a ghost town. Nia looked down at her ankle, the mark still there, glowing faintly. The pain had subsided, but the cold feeling remained, like a reminder of the darkness that lingered inside her. As she took a cautious step forward, the ground beneath her feet felt heavier, like it was soaked in the weight of invisible eyes. She knew the shadows were still watching her, lurking in the corners of her vision. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. Nia spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in a dark hood, but this time it wasn't one of the cult's members. This person moved differently, or more fluid, more dangerous. "Who are you?" Nia demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The figure stopped a few feet away, lowering their hood. To Nia's surprise, it was a woman, tall, with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through her. "I'm someone who knows what you're up against," the woman said, her voice low and steady. "You don't belong in this war, but you've been dragged into it." Nia frowned, confused. "What war? What are you talking about?" The woman stepped closer, her expression grave. "The war between light and shadow. You've been marked, and now the shadows are trying to claim you. But you're not alone in this." Nia's heart raced. "I don't understand, how do you know about the mark?" The woman's eyes flicked to Nia's ankle, where the mark glowed faintly. "Because I've seen it before. I fought against it. And I can help you." For the first time, Nia felt a glimmer of hope. "How? How can you help me?" The woman's eyes darkened, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "You can't defeat the shadows alone. But if you trust me, we might have a chance to turn the tide." Nia's mind whirled with questions, but she knew one thing for sure, she couldn't do this alone. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Good," the woman said, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. "But be warned, the deeper you go, the darker it gets." Nia had no choice but to follow the mysterious woman through the empty streets of Kisa. The city felt strange, as if something had shifted in the air. Every corner seemed darker, every shadow longer, and the silence weighed heavily on her. Her mind raced with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Where are we going?" Nia finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. The woman glanced over her shoulder, her eyes sharp. "There's a place where the shadows gather, a place where we can confront them. But it's dangerous. Once we enter, there's no turning back." Nia's heart pounded in her chest. "Why are you helping me?" The woman's expression softened for a moment. "Because I was once like you. I tried to fight the darkness alone, and I nearly lost myself. But you still have a chance." As they walked, Nia noticed something strange. The shadows seemed to move, almost like they were alive, crawling along the walls and creeping toward them. She could feel them closing in, and it sent chills down her spine. Suddenly, the woman stopped in front of an old, crumbling building. It looked abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it, like the darkness clung to it more than anywhere else. "This is it," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nia swallowed hard, her palms sweaty. "What do we do now?" The woman turned to face her, her expression grim. "We fight. But remember, this is only the beginning. The shadows will try to break you, to control you. But you must stay strong." Before Nia could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The shadows around them thickened, swirling like a dark storm. Out of the darkness emerged figures, shadowy creatures with glowing eyes, their bodies shifting and twisting like smoke. "They are here," the woman said, her voice steady. "Stay close." Nia's heart raced as the shadowy figures advanced toward them. She could feel the mark on her ankle pulsing, like it was calling to the creatures. Fear gripped her, but she knew she couldn't run. Not anymore. The first creature lunged at them, and the woman moved with lightning speed, her hand glowing with a strange light as she struck the creature, dispersing it into nothingness. Nia watched in awe as the woman fought, her movements graceful yet deadly. But there were too many of them. The shadows closed in, surrounding them on all sides. Nia's breath hitched as she felt the cold grip of the darkness creeping closer, but something inside her refused to give in. With a sudden burst of determination, she raised her hand, and to her shock, a pulse of light shot out, striking one of the creatures and sending it recoiling into the darkness. The woman glanced at her, a small smile on her lips. "You have the power. Now use it." Nia's pulse raced as the light pulsed from her hand. She was as shocked as the shadow creatures recoiling from the sudden burst of energy. Her heart pounded in her ears, and her mind spun in disbelief. What was that?" she whispered, staring at her hand. The woman's gaze was sharp, intense. "You have more power than you realize. The mark is not just a curse, it can be a weapon. But if you don't control it, it will control you." Nia's head spun with confusion, fear, and adrenaline. Her entire world was unraveling, and now she was in the middle of a battle with shadow creatures, wielding a power she never knew she had. But there was no time to process. The shadow creatures regrouped, their glowing eyes narrowing as they advanced again, this time more deliberately. Suddenly, the shadows lunged again, and this time, Nia was ready. She raised her hand instinctively, another burst of light exploding from her palm. The creatures screamed, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt deep inside her bones as they melted back into the darkness. But something was wrong. Instead of disappearing, the shadows around them began to twist, spiraling like a vortex. The air itself seemed to thicken, and Nia felt a deep pull in her chest, as if the darkness was trying to drag her into its core. "What's happening?" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the swirling shadows. The woman's face was grim, her eyes scanning the vortex. "They are trying to pull you in, to consume your power. They've sensed your strength, and they won't stop until they've taken everything." Before Nia could respond, the ground beneath them shook violently, and from the vortex, a figure began to emerge. It was not like the other creatures, this one was massive, towering above them, its body made entirely of swirling darkness, its eyes glowing with an intense, fiery light. Nia's breath caught in her throat. This was something else. Something much worse. The woman stepped in front of her, her body tense, her eyes locked on the massive figure. "Stay behind me," she ordered, her voice steely. "This is not a fight you're ready for." But even as the woman spoke, Nia could feel the pull of the vortex growing stronger. The mark on her ankle burned, and she felt a strange connection to the creature, as if it was calling to her, pulling her into the darkness. No, Nia whispered, her voice trembling. I can't. I won't let this happen. Suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked open, and Nia was thrown to her knees. The vortex surged forward, and the creature let out a deafening roar, its glowing eyes locked on her. The woman spun around, her eyes wide with shock. Nia, no. Don't give in. But it was too late. The pull of the vortex was too strong, and Nia felt herself being dragged toward the darkness. The ground crumbled beneath her, and she reached out desperately, trying to grab hold of something, anything. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the broken street, but the shadows wrapped around her like cold hands, pulling her down, deeper into the void. As the darkness closed in around her, Nia screamed. But in the back of her mind, she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Nia was falling into a pit of endless black. Her mind swirled with confusion, terror, and a deep sense of dread. She could feel the shadows pressing in on her from all sides, whispering dark promises in her ear. Let go, embrace the darkness, you belong to us. The voices were everywhere, filling her head, overwhelming her senses. But through the chaos, she could hear something else, a distant sound, faint at first but growing louder. It was a heartbeat. Her heartbeat. And then, just as suddenly as the descent began, it stopped. Nia found herself standing in a vast, empty space. The ground beneath her was solid, but there was no light, no sky, nothing but an endless black horizon. The air was thick with tension, and her skin prickled with an eerie sensation, like something was watching her. She wasn't alone. Nia. The voice came from behind her, and she turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing a few feet away was the last person she expected to see, her mother. But something was off. Her mother's eyes were wrong. They glowed with a strange, unearthly light, the same light she had seen in the eyes of the shadow creatures. Mom. Nia's voice trembled. How are you here? Her mother smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold, distant, almost cruel. You've always known this was your destiny, Nia. You can't run from it anymore. Nia shook her head, stepping back. No. This isn't real. You're not real. Her mother's smile widened. Oh, it's very real. And you're a part of it now. The mark chose you for a reason. You're special, Nia. You belong to us. Nia's heart raced as the shadows around her mother began to twist and writhe, forming dark shapes. Her mother's face began to change into something horrible, her body dissolving into the same swirling darkness as the shadow creatures. You will join us, Nia, the creature hissed, its voice no longer her mother's. You cannot fight the darkness. It's already inside you. Nia stumbled back, her mind spinning. This was wrong. All wrong. But deep down, she could feel it, the darkness inside her, clawing its way to the surface. No, she screamed, her hands trembling. I won't let this happen. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her ankle, and the mark began to glow brighter, searing her skin. The darkness surged forward, and Nia was thrown to the ground, her body racked with pain. As the shadows closed in, a voice echoed in her mind, soft but firm. It wasn't the voice of the darkness, it was something else, something stronger. Fight it, Nia. Don't give in. With a final burst of strength, Nia pushed herself up, her body trembling with the effort. The shadows recoiled as she stood, her mark glowing brighter, cutting through the darkness. I am not yours, Nia whispered, her voice steady. I will never be yours. The creature let out a guttural sound as the light from her mark exploded, shattering the darkness around her. For a moment, everything was blindingly bright, and Nia felt herself being lifted out of the abyss. And then, she was back. Back in the city of Kisa, standing in the street, the woman by her side. You did it, the woman said, her voice filled with awe. You fought them off. But Nia didn't feel victorious. The mark still burned, and the shadows still lingered in the corners of her vision. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Nia stood in the middle of the street, her breath shallow, eyes wide as the reality of what had just happened settled in. She had fought the shadows, but the battle was not over. The city of Kisa was eerily quiet now, as if it had been watching the entire ordeal unfold. The woman beside her had a grim look on her face. You're not out of danger. You've only scratched the surface. The darkness you fought isn't just inside you, it's in this city. The cult that worships it, they will come for you now. Nia clenched her fists. I don't care who they are. I'm not giving in to them. You'll need to be ready, Nia. The mark is a beacon, and they're already searching for you. The cult's leader is far more dangerous than the shadows you faced. He's known only as the Speaker of the Abyss. He controls the darkest magic in this world, and if you aren't careful, he'll manipulate your power and use it against you. Nia shivered at the name. She had heard whispers of the cult around the city, strange stories about their rituals, but nothing had prepared her for this. How do we stop him? The woman shook her head. The speaker cannot be stopped easily. He knows you're the key to unlocking their full power. If he gets to you fast, everything will be lost. Before Nia could respond, a sharp, piercing sound filled the air. She turned around, and in the distance, she saw a figure standing at the end of the street. The figure wore a long, dark cloak, the edges of which seemed to dissolve into the shadows. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but Nia could feel the weight of his gaze. This wasn't an ordinary person. The woman's face went pale. It's him. Nia's heart pounded in her chest. The speaker. Without another word, the woman grabbed Nia's arm and started running. They dashed through the narrow streets of Kisa, their footsteps echoing off the ancient stone walls. But no matter how fast they ran, Nia could feel the presence of the cloaked figure closing in on them, like the shadows themselves were bending to his will. As they rounded a corner, the woman skidded to a halt. Standing in front of them was another shadow figure, taller and more horrible than the ones before. It moved slowly, deliberately, blocking their path. We are trapped, Nia whispered, her voice trembling. The woman tightened her grip on Nia's arm. We fight. Without warning, the shadow lunged at them. Nia raised her hand, expecting the light to burst forth again, but nothing happened. Panic surged through her as the creature's cold hands reached for her hand. The woman leaped in front of her, a small stick flashing in her hand. She slashed at the shadow, causing it to hiss and retreat, but it didn't back off completely. It circled them, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. You have to control the power, Nia, the woman shouted. The mark responds to your will, your emotions. Focus. Nia closed her eyes, trying to block out the terror, the chaos, the overwhelming darkness pressing in on her from all sides. She reached deep within herself, searching for the light, for something, anything, that could help her fight back. Suddenly, she felt it. A warmth, faint but growing stronger. It pulsed through her veins, up her arm and into her hand. When she opened her eyes, her hand glowed with a soft, golden light. The shadow creature recoiled, but it wasn't enough. The speaker was still approaching, his presence suffocating the air around them. You have to go now, the woman yelled, pushing Nia forward. Run, and don't stop until you're far from here. But what about you? I'll hold him off. You're more important than you realize. Find the others who can help you. There are people who know how to defeat him, but you have to stay alive long enough to find them. Tears welled in Nia's eyes, but there was no time to argue. With one final look at the woman, she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cobblestone streets. The farther she ran, the heavier her heart became. She didn't want to leave the woman behind, but deep down, she knew it was the only way. As she reached the outskirts of the city, the distant sound of battle faded, replaced by the unsettling silence of the night. Nia slowed down, panting heavily. Her mind raced with questions, with fear, but one thing was certain: this was just the beginning. Nia is now alone with no one to guide her, and with the speaker of the abyss still hunting her. Will she make it? Watch the next episode to find out.